Hello everyone, welcome back to another Live at 5. I am your curator, Kevin Adkisson, bringing you weekly stories from the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research. We are now in week 14, I think, of COVID-related shutdowns, which means virtual tours for you at home. I hope that you've been enjoying our longer Live at 5. Today we are doing a soft transition to our new model, which are going to be shorter Live at 5 tours, more focused on individual objects in stories. We're doing this both so that I can bring you more stories and more objects that aren't necessarily whole building tours. And we're also doing it because we are starting to launch new initiatives, including Uncovering Cranbrook, which is a new lecture series that I imagine is going to be launched some point to your email inbox as we speak, because I just finished doing a last round of copy edits. Uncovering Cranbrook is going to be a series of online hour-long lectures and question and answers about different Cranbrook stories and different Cranbrook people. The first one is going to be July 28th at 10 a.m. and 7 p.m. And I will be leading that lecture on Studio Loya Saarinen. And I'll talk a bit more about Uncovering Cranbrook at the end of today's Live at 5. On today's tour, I am coming to you from the lowest part of Cranbrook's campus, geographically. On the far eastern edge of the property is the Cranbrook Japanese Garden. And I want to talk a little bit about the garden history, but especially focus on two objects in the garden. The Kasugadoro lantern behind me, and the red bridge that we all know and love, one of the great photograph spots on the campus. So the Cranbrook Japanese Garden is actually one of the oldest landscapes at Cranbrook, but it's also one of the oldest Japanese gardens in North America. It's one of only a handful of Japanese gardens that are open to the public that are over 100 years old. And our Japanese garden got its start in 1914 as first a rock garden when George Booth's father, Henry Wood Booth, began to assemble these rocks that you see around the edge of the pond. And so it was called the Rock Garden. But even at that early date, 1914, Henry Wood Booth had already established the basic shape of the garden. It's about 1 acre, and it's defined by the Lily Pond, which is here in front of us. And the Lily Pond features two main islands. There's Round Island here at the front, which is a small little island, and then Duck Island, which I've never seen a duck, but I've seen lots of turtles, which is the larger island. So it was simply a pond fed by the new corduroy bridge that was built in 1914, which was designed by a Scottish architect and landscape designer. And this bridge goes over a dam that is holding Kingswood Lake back behind it. And so first, Henry Wood Booth simply shaped the landscape, the pond, and surrounded it with rocks. They dug a well on the northern end of the pond, and they would have picnics out here. But it all changed theming. It changed the name of the garden and what would go on to become the Japanese Garden in 1915. In March of that year, George Booth, his wife Ellen, and George's father, Henry Wood Booth, set train across the country and headed to San Francisco and San Diego. In San Diego, they visited the Panama, California exhibition, which celebrated the completion of the Panama Canal and was an illegal World's Fair that had a complete commercial Japanese garden. So it wasn't sponsored by the Japanese government, it was sponsored by Japanese businesses. And in San Diego, they loved the tea garden, the tea ceremony. They loved the Japanese art and the Japanese landscape that they saw there. Then they headed to San Francisco for the official World's Fair, the Panama Pacific Exposition. And there they saw the Imperial Japanese Pavilion, which was a very beautiful formal Japanese garden. If you've been to Golden Gate Park in San Diego, you have seen the Japanese garden that is still there from 1915. They also saw displays from different Japanese companies like the Yokohama Nursery, and they visited the S&G Gump Company, which was a importer based out of London, New York, and San Francisco. They fell in love with Japanese culture and Japanese gardening while there. And so when they came back to Cranbrook, they took a look at all of the different gardens and they said, hey, this rock garden at the low point of Cranbrook's campus, maybe we can do something inspired by our visit to the two World's Fairs. Just to point out where we are as we head back into the garden, here we have Kingswood Lake. And if you notice the grade change, you will notice the great curse of the Japanese garden. All of this water is 14 feet above the Japanese garden. It drains out, this artificially dammed Kingswood Lake drains into the Willow Pond here, which those of you who really know Cranbrook's campus, you know that down there is the old mill. And this was all built in the mid-19th century, and it was a working mill. This was all collapsed and run down when the Booths bought the property in 1904, and so the Booths slowly reconstructed it. But what we'll focus on today is the Japanese garden. And from the S&G Gump Company, the Mr. Booth, George Booth, purchased 3 bronze storks. And he came and he placed the bronze storks in March of 1915 in the middle of the water. And he wrote a letter to his son, Henry Scripps Booth. And he said, I've installed the storks from San Francisco, and it has given the rock garden a Japanese look. And so by March of 1915, he's considering it to be a Japanese garden. In December of 1915, he orders from the Yokohama Nursery a lantern, 3 plants, and they arrive in early 1916. So that by the late 19-teens, Cranbrook's Japanese garden was largely in place. Here you see before all the planting grew up, we have this rock border from the 1914 rock garden. We also have the 1915 lantern from the Yokohama Nursery, and we'll end our tour over at the 1914 Japanese bridge. So first, as we get started talking about our close objects, and as we test my ability to run a shorter live at 5, I want to focus on this lantern. This Kasuga Doro, or lantern, is possibly old, possibly ancient. Mr. Booth probably thought it was ancient. It's also quite possible it was built in 1914. And what they would do in Japan is the craftsmen, they would cover it with moss and lichen and other naturally aging material, because this form of a lantern is actually over 1,500 years old. And so the value of these lanterns doesn't come from the sort of artistic innovation, it comes from how old the lantern is. So whether or not ours is 110 years old or 210 years old, it could also be 1,000 years old, but I don't think it is. Most likely it's 100 and some odd years old. But it has the form of the type of lantern that is used at the Kasuga Shrine. The Kasuga Shrine is in Nara, Japan, which was the Japanese capital in the 8th century. And there's, at the Kasuga Shrine, there is a cypress forest that has sacred deer. The deer are messengers from the deities, and lining the path to the Kasuga Shrine are over 2,000 of this type of lantern. Now, our lantern, which is granite, starts from a hexagonal base that features these lotus motifs. So you have the lotus flower here, then it moves to a cylindrical shaft, and then it becomes a carved hexagonal firebox, or a habukuro. And so the firebox is only open on two sides. Something has happened in there since the original design. It should be open through this hexagon. And then there are four carvings on the blind side of the hexagon. Here you see a doe and then a stag on this side. Remember that the deer are sacred at the Kasuga Shrine in Nara. And then on the other side, we have the sun and the moon, which I will try not to fall into the pond. So the sun and moon have become damaged, but there are these sort of sacred carvings and then the traditional hexagonal top piece to the lantern. And the placement of it is actually pretty correct for a Japanese garden. If you look up pictures of the original shrine, you'll see that they're just along the pathway. But in a strolling pond or a strolling garden such as this, the lantern would be placed along the water's edge so that it reflects across the water in the evening from the firebox. And this is where we have to say a little note about what is a Japanese garden in America, because there is this idea of authenticity in what is authentic. And Dr. Kendall Brown, who some of you came to his lecture before I was here in 2014 or 15, and Dr. Kendall Brown, who is the leading scholar of North American Japanese gardens, he says there is no Japanese garden that is truly authentic outside of Japan. By the nature of not being in Japan, it is no longer a true Japanese garden. And so he would refer to this correctly as a Japanese style garden. And with that, we would want this to be authentic to the story of Cranbrook and the story of the booths and the story of what does it mean to have a Japanese garden, Japanese style garden in North America. And so that brings us to the next sort of aspect of today's Live at 5, which is what's happening to the Japanese garden? Good question, Kevin. Right now, the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research is working on a rehabilitation of the Japanese garden. And so we're entering into the phase 1 of the rehabilitation, and you can see that it is looking quite beautiful. So the Japanese garden, the booths, and I'll come back to talk a bit more about the lily pond cascade, but I want to turn the camera and look towards the Japanese bridge. By the 1920s, George Booth had finished the Japanese garden. Everything that was in place in the Booth's lifetime was here by 1920. And so as they began to think of Cranbrook as a larger institution and began opening the church, the schools, the art academy, they really stopped doing major work on the estate. And so when we think about how do we restore the Japanese garden back to its historic appearance, what we are doing is we're calling it a rehabilitation. And so we are studying the historic photographs, studying what George Booth did with his landscapers, but then also thinking about it as a new living landscape. And we're making choices that extend this sort of story. What if George Booth had Japanese designers? What if he had kept working on it? And so in 2017, Cranbrook received a grant from the Japanese Ministry of Infrastructure, Transport, and Tourism. The Consular General of Japan, serving Detroit, applied on Cranbrook's behalf, and we received money as well as the gardeners, led by Hiromu Terashita. 6 Japanese gardeners came over to Cranbrook, and in a week's time, they rebuilt the Lily Pond Cascade. This is an area that by 1914 was shown on the map to have this cascade, but 0 historic photographs survive. And so what you're seeing is really a 2018 idea of the Lily Pond Cascade, using historic stones as well as new stones. and taking advantage of this historic 1914 concrete pipe that connects from the Willow Pond under this pathway and into the Lily Pond Cascades. One of my favorite feature, and a feature the Japanese gardeners who came over and worked here for a week appreciated, is this amazing stump from a Siberian elm. It was about an 85-year-old tree when it was felled in around 1976, and now it sort of forms this embrace of the reinvigorated Lily Pond Cascade. There's also a mountain lantern that was designed and installed by Mr. Terashita. And this is the most ancient type of lantern. These were made on Japanese mountains with uncarved rocks. And it's simply a stack of 5 stones in the form of a lantern. And then you'll see that we also have new bridges. Now, as the landscape restoration continues, we are working with the curator of the Portland Japanese Garden, Sadafumi Ukiyama, and Sada is working on a complete master plan that will be fully ADA accessible to continue the rest of the garden. And so that will involve construction of new barrier-free ramps, as well as widening paths, restoring the garden edge. And if you want to learn more about the restoration projects that we have on the drawing boards, I encourage you to go to center.cranbrook.edu, and under the Visit tab, there's a Japanese garden page, and you can see our historic landscape study, where we have an accurate 1928 plan of the landscape, and you'll also see the new master plan and everything that we have going on. Also, with the new Uncovering Cranbrook lecture series, we're going to have additional events taking you through the Japanese garden. So today is just to whet your appetite for everything that's going on. It is amazing when you see early photos how much emptier the Japanese garden was. It really is quite overgrown. In the 70s, it was so overgrown that there's a story of a woman and her dog discovering the Japanese garden. I don't know if it was ever truly lost, but it had become so untended that the features were really, really lost. And so we're indebted to the Cranbrook House and Gardens Auxiliary, particularly Rudy Fetus, and then later Ralph Graham, for maintaining the garden in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. The 3 plants that George Booth bought in 1915, some of those still survive. He bought a wisteria, a taxus, and an umbrella pine. And so part of clearing out all of these less interesting, unhistoric trees, we can make things like this amazing Japanese cherry tree really sing. And then there are these horrible invasive Japanese butterbur, which are incredibly aggressive and grow through underground rhizomes, so if we cut them down, they'll just pop back up. And so just to give you a sense of what the Lily Pond Cascade looked like just really a couple of years ago, it was much more similar to this. And they'd really, just by pruning, will clear out so much of this to bring back some of the historic features. So next, there are lots of turtles all around Cranbrook. I'm not sure if your friend the turtle is still here, but there are a lot of turtles that will come out and sunbathe here on Duck Island. So the last part of the Japanese garden I want to focus on is the Little Red Bridge, which I'm sure I have some Kingswood graduates watching, and you may remember for many years, this garden was known as the Kingswood Oriental Garden. And as part of my research into this project, I went through I went through every Kingswood yearbook and looked at photographs that had been taken on this bridge. It not only showed me how popular it was as a senior portrait location for the girls, but I was also looking for the history of this bridge. how had it changed over time, and as we thought about restoring and essentially rebuilding the bridge, what era were we going back to? So the reason it had been known as the Kingswood Garden was because the Kingswood dormitories are directly behind me, and until all of this brush was allowed to grow up and cover it, for most of the garden's history, you saw direct from the dorms across into the garden. So this will be cleared out, and we will have the view of Eliel Saarinen's masterpiece again. But the next term, which is a little more problematic, the Oriental Garden, that was because during World War II, almost every Japanese garden in America was renamed as an Oriental Garden. It was done as a patriotic move, the same reason that German as a second language in American schools is still so unpopular. No one wanted to have a Japanese garden on their property. And so the name, the Kingswood Oriental Garden, was used until 2016, when we reverted back to the historically correct name, the Japanese Garden. What's interesting about the Japanese bridge here is that there is very little Japanese about it. Like all Japanese-style gardens in North America, this bridge is equal parts American, equal parts Japanese inspired. What's Japanese about it? Well, this beautiful shape with the flared edges. And how would George Booth have known how to design a Japanese bridge? Well, around 1910, he began clipping out pictures of Japanese gardens. And so in Cranbrook archives, we have George Booth's inspiration book. And if you go to the archives website, you will see that we actually have the entire inspiration book digitized. So you can flip through every page, and you'll see a lot of what is installed at Cranbrook House and Cranbrook Gardens has precedent, sort of historic images where he would clip it from postcards or magazines and then build a version of it here at Cranbrook. He has in the book a number of Japanese-style gardens and a number of Japanese-style bridge. Interestingly, this form of a bridge directly on a waterfall, which wouldn't necessarily be a Japanese gardening technique, because this very harsh edge makes it quite clear that this is a dam, not a natural water feature. And so that would not really be the sort of desired look in a traditional Japanese garden. But if you go to the inspiration scrapbook, there is an example of a flat bridge directly over a waterfall that is an almost exact image copy of what we see here. The construction of the little Japanese bridge is also not Japanese whatsoever. As an architecture student back at Yale, I had to study Japanese wood joinery, and we all had to draw a Japanese joint out of a hat and then build it. Of course, I got a very difficult joint that took me a full week to do with Japanese hand tools. The builders of this bridge did not go to such lengths of authenticity. In fact, you can see where the paint is sort of revealing that the bridge is actually made up of a series of wood lap joints. And so this is a straight piece of wood going to another straight piece of wood, and here is the lap joint where they've been joined together in a very much a Western joinery technique. The railings then connect to these posts. They're 9 posts, and they're connected into the bottom beam, what we would call the bridge's cord, through a pinned mortise and tenon joint, which is another Western craft joinery technique. So it's very much built in by an American craftsman. I wish it was, an itinerant Japanese traveling craftsperson had shown up, but it's probably the same craftsman it was a Scottish designer who helped realize most of George Booth's sketches for bridges on the property. So we do attribute it to the same gentleman. Originally, just these bolts were the ones that were shown on the front of the cord, because that is the tenon joint that is keeping this post in place. And then there is this lovely wooden rail in front, so that in the high sun in the springtime, before all the leaves have come in, you see the shadow cast down the railing. And then in the winter, the snow catches this little railing, and so you have a snow line on the top of the railing, and then snow and snow. And that's something that's very important in Japanese garden design. If you think about Japanese gates or walls, or even the plant species, Japanese gardens do not generally get their visual interest from flowering plants, but from the way that light, snow, and the weather and the seasons create visual interest across the year. Now, this bridge was not here when I moved to Cranbrook in August of 2016. It was down in the wood shop. It had been taken apart because it was collapsing. And so I came in a little late to the reconstruction, and I was tasked with learning about the bridge. So I went through all the yearbooks, I went through all the House and Gardens records, I talked to anyone who could remember anything about it. And what I discovered was that Steve Trout, who very beautifully reconstructed the base of the bridge, had handmade all of these bolts here. But these bolts, which are supporting L brackets that hold the treads of the bridge, these were actually added after a flood in 1957. Originally, the bridge was joined in a different manner. In 1957, a huge flood, which took out a number of things around campus, flooded Kingswood Lake and then rushed through the Japanese garden. The bridge was completely dislodged and was thrown downriver. And when it was reconstructed in 1957, all of those bolts got put on the side. So these are now reconstructed again. It does fit the history. Perhaps had I done the research a little bit earlier, we would have a different effect, but it's still a beautiful job. The other main change with the 2016 reconstruction of the bridge is that instead of having 3 wooden boards lap jointed together, Steve Trout used laminated redwood. So he used sort of 1/4-inch thick redwood strips, and then he made a jig of plywood with the exact shape he wanted, and then he glued them together and he laminated this arch. The redwood should last even longer, another 100 years. You can actually see just through the wood where those laminations are beginning to show through the paint. The railings on the bridge, however, were not reconstructed. So the railings actually are from 1914 or 1915. There's a map in 1914 that lists Japanese bridge, but there's no photograph until 1916, so we don't know the exact date of this bridge. However, the railings are from that earliest date. And one thing I learned, after the flood of 57, the railings were put on backwards, and so this exterior line was actually facing the inside of the red bridge. And so we were able to get that corrected in 2016. I don't know if anyone has any other questions about the bridge. Oh, I know what your question is. This flood management system. This actually did not come in the 1957 flood. It came from an even later flood with the idea that instead of wiping out the bridge, if the water gets too high, it will simply flow around the bridge. The solution that Sadafumi Ukiyama has come up with, which I think is very elegant and I'm very excited to see implemented, the bridge should actually land level with the pathway, and there be no sort of difference from the new pathway to the bridge. And so what Sada has proposed is that we both raise the bridge slightly and then we lower the water slightly. And so we will build a new, almost imperceptible dam here that will lower the water once and then lower it a second time. And so there'll be enough room for the water to get safely under the bridge, even at a flooding height. And we won't have these rather unfortunate sort of spillways on either side of the Japanese bridge. So this has been our tour of the Japanese garden. I do encourage you, if you want to learn more, there's a very detailed timeline on the website. I wrote an essay about the bridge. Greg Whitkoff, the director of the Center for Collections and Research, wrote a history and a history of the lantern. And you can also see the plans, the rehabilitation plan, the historic landscape study. We're very excited to continue working on this garden with the leadership from the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research Japanese Garden Advisory Group, led by Karen Hagenlocker, and I see Tom Booth is here. So we're grateful to the volunteer leaderships who are helping to steward this project, and we're grateful to the Japanese Consular General in Detroit, who has been so enthusiastic for the project, Emily Frankowiak, who is Michigan's only certified aesthetic pruner, who is out here working in the garden. If you see someone with laser focus and her tools in her belt, she is helping slowly work away around pruning the trees and keeping it looking great. And I'm grateful to all of our friends in the Japanese American community who have featured us in their news and in their outreach. And so I really hope that soon, in the next couple of years, the Japanese garden will be even more beautiful than it ever has been, and that it will be a really special and magical little corner of the Cranbrook campus. Thanks for joining me for another Live at 5. I promised I'd tell you a little bit more about the upcoming series Uncovering Cranbrook. These are going to be lectures given by me, by my boss, Greg Whitkoff, as well as the head archivist, Deborah Rice. And they're going to be hour-long lectures similar to Live at 5, except we'll be giving them from our respective homes or offices. And so what I'm hoping will be a real benefit of these new lectures is using more of the incredible resources of Cranbrook archives. And so with Studio Loya Saarinen coming up on July 28th, that's not next Tuesday, but the Tuesday after, the amount of historic photographs we have of Loya Saarinen and her Swedish weavers, as well as the product, the rugs and the beautiful curtains and tapestries that were produced for Kingswood, for the Art Academy, and for projects around the country. It will be similar to Live at 5 in that it will be me blabbering on, but I'm going to have the support of all of these wonderful historic images. And I think what Greg and what Deborah have in store are other things beyond just what survives the campus buildings, but the many stories of the people that have made Cranbrook such a important place in the history of art, science, and education. So thank you for watching today's Live at 5. Make sure that you're signed up for the emails from the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research so that you hear when new Uncovering Cranbrook lectures and talks are coming up. We'll have one in early August about murals by Zoltan Zepeshi coming live from the Conservation Studio. There's a lot of things on the boards. Once we've committed to being a digital institution, we're really going to get off and rolling with our fall programming, late summer and fall programming that anyone around the country can watch from the comfort of their living room. Please be safe out there, everyone. Please wear your mask. Cranbrook, the campus, is now officially reopened, so if you're local, come out and check out the Japanese garden. I recommend reading up about it first on the website, maybe even print out the new plan and see if you can find or locate all of the things that are in store. I'm Kevin Adkisson, your curator, and this has been another Live at 5 from the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research. Thanks for watching, everyone.